Excellent. I believe we are live. Good evening, everyone, and Property Development Australia and Facebook Live World. Welcome to, I better admit everyone. Welcome to the Business of Property. We have a special guest today, David Klingberg from Smart Planning and Design. Welcome, David. How are you this evening?
I'm extremely well, thanks, Cheryl.
Fantastic.
Extremely well.
Welcome, everyone. I'm very, very well. Keeping nice and snug and warm. Um, I am letting a few people into the Zoom room. Those of you that are not in the Zoom room, welcome to Facebook Land. You're more than welcome to comment through this session. What we're going to go through, and the question that's been going around recently is this low-rise housing diversity code, David. People have been asking about manor houses,
Yes.
and it's very much a topic of interest in the development community, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
However, this isn't new. The code itself, well, it's been rejigged and renamed most recently. Um, and as of recently, 1st of July, the low-rise medium density housing code, which is a bit of a mouthful, was actually renamed the low-rise housing diversity code to actually reflect the diverse housing choices it provides. And this is, and I'll preface this to say, this is applicable to New South Wales only, what we're talking about. So, but it will be interesting for anyone else from other states to sort of have a look at what's happening in the New South Wales space.
Mm.
So, David, you have very generously put it together a bit of a slideshow for us to go through what the code's about, to demystify it,
Yes.
because I said this has been out and about for quite a bit. And so what we might do is go through your presentation, and anyone that has questions, please feel free to pop it into either the Zoom chat or the Facebook Live comments. And what we'll do is have a bit of a Q&A at the very end.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds good. Before we start, David, tell us a little bit about smart planning and design.
Smart planning and design. We're a town planning. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to start with.
Thank you for being here.
I'm loving, I'm loving the Zoom room. Our company's a town planning and urban design and landscape design company. I'm a town planner and urban designer. We have on our team town planners and landscape architects. We get people development approvals. I've been doing this for about 30 or so years. It's my second town planning company. We do work in New South Wales and Victoria primarily. Most recently, I've been working with the City of Bayside on their design review panel, and I teach for the Planning Institute of Australia as well. So I love this industry. It's fantastic. You get to meet amazing people, and during these COVID times, it's still one of the drivers of industry in Australia. So it's fantastic to be part of it, and thank you again for the opportunity.
No, thank you. So excellent. Let's dive into this because it's quite a meaty subject, and we've got a bit to go through. So what I'm going to do is hand it over to you to share your screen,
Yep. Let's
and
see
I'm
how
going
it
to.
goes here. Can you see that?
It is starting to share. There we go.
Okay, I've lost control of the slides. Oh no, I haven't. There we go. All right, wonderful. Thank you so much again for your time, and thanks everybody in the Zoom room. This presentation is about demystifying the low-rise housing diversity code and design guide for complying development. And I come from I have a long history of writing design codes and guides, and as I said, working in New South Wales and Victoria, applying these very things. I've actually written design codes for the Stockland Development Company, and as part of my development application processes, we often get asked to review documents against design codes. Fast tracking development approvals is something that I'm passionate about, and this is obviously a tool that enables us to do that. I'm going to start off by talking a bit of going back to first principles for those of you in the room who need to do that, and from there on we'll dive deep into what the code and the guide is, and you'll hear me talking during the presentation about both the code and the guide and its application. I'm going to try and wrap up the bulk of the presentation by about 8:45. You'll see me looking over to my right here a little bit every now and again to check the time. And but with no further ado, we'll get into it. So this is about demystifying. As I said, we'll go back to first principles. First principles is that I think that development is what I call fab. It's absolutely great to be part of this industry. Fab for me stands for feasibility, approvals, and building. We're all on that journey, I hope, in some way to get people development approvals. And what we like to do in the development industry at Smart Planning and Design is bring people together to understand development, whether or not you're in the feasibility phase, the approvals phase, or the building phase of your development. The planning system in Australia is primarily made up of two bits: strategic planning and statutory planning. Strategic planning is the creation of the plans and the thinking behind town planning, and the code and the guide in a way is a bit like strategic planning, or it is strategic planning. It's thinking about and applying and putting into and codifying what the government thinks is appropriate for development, and then using that guide and that code to enable statutory planning. Statutory planning is when you go through the process of getting a development approval. So strategic planning is the thinking behind the planning of a place, be it in terms of a structure plan or an urban design framework, housing strategies and the like, or indeed design guidelines and codes that we're talking about, like we're talking about tonight. Statutory planning, which you're probably more all familiar with, is getting people development approvals, taking you through that process from beginning to end of getting your plans done to start with, and then going through the process of a development approval with council. That typically looks like this, where you prepare and submit a planning permit application, you lodge it with council. There's internal and external referrals and amendments, and then council makes a decision. What this code does and design guide does is it changes that process a little bit, and I'll talk about that. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So what is low-rise housing diversity? Low-rise housing diversity housing. For the purpose of the low-rise housing diversity code and the low-rise housing diversity guide, low-rise housing diversity residential development means dual occupancies, manor houses, and one above the other dual occupancies, buildings of between 2 to 4 dwellings, and multi-dwelling housing or terraces. The code is it's development that contains 2 or more dwellings and is no more than 2 stories in height. The code also allows the conversion of an existing house into a dual occupancy. The subdivision and the conversion will be required to comply with all the development standards of a new development that new development needs to meet. The subdivision of low-rise housing diversity may also be carried out as complying development if certain development standards in the Housing Diversity Code and Housing Diversity Guide. Housing Diversity Guide does not include development on battle acts such as lots or the creation of new battle acts lots. So what does so we're talking about dual occupancies, manor houses, or multi-dwelling houses. Dual occupancies identified in the code is can either be attached or detached. These images here show attached dual occupancies, meaning two dwellings on a lot of land that are attached to each other, or detached, which you see here, which means two dwelling. A manor house is a building containing 3 or 4 dwellings where each dwelling is attached to another dwelling by a common wall or floor, and at least one dwelling is partially or wholly located above another dwelling. And the building again contains no more than 2 stories. House here. While this looks like attached dwelling on the left, whilst it is, they're actually manor houses form. And then multi-dwelling houses or terraces, which are 3 or more dwellings on a lot of land where each dwelling has access at ground level. No part of a dwelling is above any part or any other part of the dwelling, and the dwellings face and generally follow the alignment of 1 or more public roads. And again, you can see some various typologies here. In this example where the parking is to the rear there, obviously. Parking comes through the middle of the block, parking from a laneway, or in actual fact can be parking underground with a basement level. So what is the Low-Rise Housing Diversity Code? Known as the Low-Rise Medium Density Housing Code, the Low-Rise Housing Diversity Code allows well-designed dual occupancies, manor houses and terraces up to 2 stories to be carried out under a fast-track complying development. The code was developed to ensure amenity, privacy and design considerations are incorporated into the development standards, and any good design outcomes can be achieved across, the state. So that's why the code was developed. What is the Low-Rise Housing Diversity Code for complying development? Well, it provides the design guide provides consistent planning and design standards for dual occupancies, manor houses and terraces. And the design guide promotes good design outcomes and provides guidance on layout, landscaping, private open space, etc., etc. So remember, we're talking about both the code and the guide for complying development. So what is complying development? So complying development is a fast track planning and building approval for straightforward development, such as 1 or 2 story homes. You might be asking the question, how will the code facilitate, or how does it facilitate faster housing approval? Well, the code includes tailored, simplified development standards for the different housing types, which makes it easier to use the complying development pathway. Okay, and the code provides development standards that are written in plain English and contains explanatory diagrams to make the code simple and easy to use. So by complying with the code and the design guides, you enable yourself to have what is called a complying development pathway. And a complying development is a fast track planning and building approval for what they call straightforward development. So who is the guide intended for? It's really intended to assist developers, planners, urban designers, architects, building designers, landscape architects and builders, people in the development profession, to prepare a complying development proposal and assist planning professionals in local and state government with strategic planning, and to inform the community about what is good design. That's what the guide is intended for. So the aims of the guide it's intended to help achieve better design and planning for low-rise housing diversity by providing the requirements for designing and assessing those developments as complying development. So the hook to get complying development and a faster track planning approval is to do these 3 types of development in the way that the code and the guide identify. So the Housing Diversity Design Guide aims to deliver better quality design, improve the quality of neighbourhoods and precincts, improve livability, including better layout, dwelling depths and ceiling heights, deliver quality landscaping, deliver improved sustainability, improve the relationship of dwellings to the public domain, deliver design guidance and assist in providing a diverse housing mix and choice, and provide guidance in the preparing of a complying, what they call a complying development certificate. So this is starting to introduce the concept of the paperwork and the things you need to do in order to start the process of getting your complying development and your approval. So where does the code apply? Well, it's a New South Wales code. In actual fact, there aren't too many other similar, because I do work around Australia, there aren't too many other similar complying development type codes out there in other jurisdictions. There certainly isn't such a thing in Victoria per se. There are fast track planning application processes, but not attached to codes like this. So the code applies across all of New South Wales in R1, R2, R3 and R5 zones, where dual occupancies, manor houses and multi-dwelling housing are permitted under the council LEP. A dual occupancy manor house or terrace may only be carried out if the development is permitted within the zone under the relevant LEP. And each new dual occupancy or terrace house must have a frontage to a public road. Really importantly, a local character statement is not a mechanism to exclude local areas from the application of the code. So when does the design guide apply? The design guide is referenced in the SEP. The low-rise housing diversity code in part 3B of the code SEP contains the development standards for manor houses, multi-dwelling housing and dual occupancy, and the design guide contains the design criteria that must be met in order to obtain a complying development certificate under part 3B of the code SEP. The Environmental Planning and Assessment Regs 2000 requires that a qualified designer, I'll touch on this a bit more later, qualified designer or a building designer accredited by the Building Designers Association of Australia must firstly submit a design verification statement verifying that they have designed or directed the design of the development and verify that the design of the development is consistent with the design criteria in the design guide. So how do you go about obtaining approval? What is the complying development assessment process? So the complying development is a fast track approvals process for straightforward residential, commercial and industrial development. It combines the planning and building approvals in one application. Providing the application meets specific criteria, it can be determined by an accredited council private certifier without the need for a development application. Guidance on preparing and assessing an application for a CDC can be found in section 4 of the guide. And by the way, you can download the guide from the internet. Just Google the low-rise housing diversity code and design guidance, easily found there. As I said before, the following diverse low-rise housing development can be assessed as complying development under the code. We've mentioned before the dual occupancies, the manor houses and the multi-dwelling housing. So obtaining approval, there's development standards. The proposed development must comply within the development standards contained within part 3B of the code SEP. Design criteria is applied. The code SEP requires the proposed development satisfies the relevant design criteria, and we'll go into that in a minute. Submission requirements for complying developments are set within Schedule 1 of the EPNA regs. The EPNA regs require that an architect, and we've talked about this previously before, an architect or immediately directed the design of the development. A prepared design verification statement, and you're given tools for this, is required to illustrate how the design criteria in section 2 of the Housing Diversity Design Guide has been achieved. You might be asking, what is a design verification statement? Well, the code requires a design verification statement to accompany a complying development application for dual occupancies, manor houses and terraces. Importantly, the design verification statement ensures dual occupancies, manor houses and terraces are appropriately designed, having regard to the design guide. It ensures that the local character of an area is retained. The design verification statement must be prepared by a qualified designer, as I said before, or a building designer, accredited by the Building Designers Association of Australia. Qualified designer, it's stated, is a person registered as an architect in accordance with the Architects Act. And again, as I said before, the designer must verify in the design verification statement that he or she has designed or directed the design of a development and must address how the proposed development is consistent with the relevant design criteria in the design guide. So how do we use the guide? The guide has 4 sections. Section number 1 is the introduction, and the introduction on how and when to apply the low-rise diversity guide. It sets out an overarching design principles that enable good design for diverse low-rise housing. Section 2 is the design criteria. That section provides objectives and design criteria for the 3 different types of housing, low-rise housing. And the design, just manipulate my screen here, sorry. There we go. The design criteria provides a straightforward means for development to comply with the objectives and the overarching principles. And to obtain a complying development certificate, the proposed development must satisfy each of the design criteria for the relevant design type. And there are quite a number of design criteria for each of the 3 different types. And when you download the guide, you'll see a comprehensive list of that design criteria. And I'll show you some examples or some relevant examples of those later. There is also explanatory guidance. That's in section 3. The explanatory guidance is provided to assist interpretation and assessment of proposals against the design criteria. The explanatory guidance sets out the intent behind the design criteria and provides advice on achieving good design outcomes in diverse low-rise housing development. Designers will use this section to provide clarification of the meaning of terms used in the section 2, and it provides approaches that might be used to achieve the design criteria and seek general guidance, advice on good design outcomes. And council can use this section to help them establish precinct plans and principal controls for a locality. And the community can use this section to better understand how the design of the development can achieve good design outcomes. Section 4 of the guide includes information to assist in the preparation and assessment of a development of an application for a complying development certificate. And then there are the various appendices provided and provides provision of templates for the design verification statement that must be submitted with an application for a complying development certificate. And there's a glossary of terms, commonly used terms in those appendices. So complying development, just to recap, a complying development application can be submitted where it meets the general requirements for complying development under Part 1 of the Code Set, development standards contained within Part 3B of the Code Set, and the design criteria contained within this design guide. So the complying development application can be submitted when you have those three elements. The development standards for compliant development can be found in part 3 of the code step, as I said before, and a summary of the steps required to prepare a complying development certificate, CDC development standards, is provided on the left there. So you'll see the various parts there. Firstly, you check the land use zoning and minimum lot size. Secondly, you need to comply with the land-based requirements under the SEP. Thirdly, you have to comply with the development standards, part 3, the low-rise housing diversity code. You have to have consistency with design criteria, and then you need to prepare the design verification statement. Okay, so as I said before, the guide is broken up into various parts. Really important part and a very significant part is the section 2, the design criteria. So the design criteria section provides the specific objectives and design criteria that relate to the different types of low-rise diverse housing. A complying development certificate must be consistent with each of the design criteria. So there are objectives that relate to the design principles, and they set out what the design should achieve. And then there's design criteria, and they are the measurable standards that are deemed to meet the objectives. So each relevant design criteria is required, has to be satisfied to obtain a complying development certificate. You'll see there under objectives, it says that they relate to the design principles and set out what the design should achieve. So for the designers in the room, there are a number of principles which I'll briefly go over. There's 9 of them. Principle number 1 is context and neighbourhood character. Principle number 2 is built form and scale. Principle number 3 is density. Principle number 4 is sustainability. Principle number 5 is landscape. Principle number 6 is amenity. Principle number 7 is safety. Principle number 8 is housing diversity and social interaction. And principle number 9 is aesthetics. And under each of those for each of those design principles, there are statements which talk to things like, under context and neighbourhood character, good design responds and contributes to its context. Context includes the key natural and built features of an area, the relationship and the character they create when combined. It also includes social, economic, health and environmental conditions. Responding to context involves identifying the desirable elements of an area's existing or future character. Well-designed buildings respond to and enhance the qualities and identify of an identity of the area, including the adjacent sites, streetscape and neighbourhood. It is very important to understand these principles because some of the responses required for your CDC in actual fact need to go back to these principles. That's the reason why I'm talking about them. So just to recap, under section 2 of the guide, a really important section is the design criteria section. And as it says here, the design criteria are the measurable standards that are deemed to meet the objectives. And each relevant design criteria is required to be satisfied, has to be satisfied to obtain a complying development certificate. So what do these look like? Okay, for example, the objective under dwelling size and layout, the design criteria around dwelling size and layout. You've got an objective here. The dwelling is has a the dwelling has a sufficient area, this is the objective, to ensure the layout of the rooms is functional, well organised, and provides a high standard of amenity. What is the design criteria for that? Well, there's a number of them. Dwellings are required to have minimum internal floor areas. The minimum internal areas outlined above only include one bathroom. The minimum area of each additional bathroom is 5 square metres added onto the minimum dwelling area. So you can see that there's quite a lot of detail. In the design criteria in each section in order to achieve the objective. And each of these does need to be addressed. And I'll show you later how that can be addressed. Another example of another objective is under dwelling size and layout, is that room sizes are appropriate for the intended purpose and number of occupants. So you'll see here some design criteria. Again, it's required to obtain a complying development certificate. Under principal private open spaces, the objective is that dwellings provide appropriate size private open space and balconies to enhance residential amenity. And another objective is that principal private open space and balconies are appropriately located to enhance livability for residents. The design criteria for that is that the area of private open, one of the design criteria, 45, the area of principal private open space provided for each dwelling is at least 16 square metres with a minimum length and width of 3 metres. 46, 25% of the private open space should be covered to provide shade and protection from the rain, and so on and so forth. Now, it is also important to note that for each of the 3 different dwelling typologies, there is a list of design criteria for each of those different typologies. So you'll need to have a practitioner that's familiar in writing your application, that is familiar with the 3 different types or the type of development that you're wanting to do. So there are a number, as I said before, of design criteria, objectives, and the design criteria associated with the objectives. The explanatory guidance is the next section of the guide. So using section 3 of the explanatory guidance, design guidance is provided to assist interpretation of the design criteria. It explains the intent behind the design criteria and provides advice on how to achieve good design outcomes. Building designers and architects should use this section for guidance on how a development should relate to its immediate context and interface with other buildings and the public domain and provide good quality landscaped areas. Examples of this explanatory guidance in the guide can be seen here. You've got, typically you have guidance notes, you've got design, related design principles. In this case, you've got pedestrian and a section on dealing with pedestrian and vehicle access. You've got related design principles, where you can cross-check for good design principles. Design principle 2, built form and scale relating pedestrian vehicle access, landscaping, housing, diversity and social interaction. So you see a lot of thoughts going into the layout of the guide. You'll see the guidance notes there, in this case under pedestrian vehicle access. The location, type and design of vehicle access points have significant impact on streetscape, site layout and building facade design. The circulation networks should be clear and legible. Internal streets in the form of mews and low traffic streets are to prioritise pedestrians with shared surfaces and the use of different surface materials, etc., etc. So that's the guidance notes. You'll also see for each of the explanatory, in section 3, under the explanatory guidance, you'll also see some diagrams that illustrate how you can achieve these good outcomes. And then you've got specific design guidance, which provides on how The objectives and the design criteria must be met. So that sheet is for pedestrian and vehicle access. Here you'll see orientation, siting and subdivision. There's quite a number of these. It numbers at least or around about 30 or so, 25 or so, sorry, of these explanatory guidance pages. So it can be quite complex for the development application or the application or that you're doing. And again, as I said before, each of these sheets is made up of guidance notes, diagrams that can help you designer and design guidance. So the process, again, to prepare a complying development certificate. Firstly, you check your land use zone and your minimum lot size. Permitted uses can be found in the land use tables for your different zones. You need to comply with the land-based requirements. Thirdly, you need to comply with the development standards. You need to refer to Part 3B of the code set for development standards on maximum height of buildings, floor space ratio, front, side and rear setbacks, landscaped areas, earthworks, bushfire, flood-prone land, tree removal, etc. You need to have consistency with the design criteria using the Housing Diversity Design Guide, and you need to prepare a designed verification statement. And remember that all of this work does need to be done, and I will flip back now because it's important to note. It does need to be done by a qualified designer or a building designer, accredited by the Building Designers Association of Australia. A qualified designer, as it says here, is a person registered as an architect in accordance with the Architects Act. And the designer must verify in the design verification statement that he or she has designed or directed the design of a development and must address how the proposed development is consistent with the relevant design criteria in the design guide. That's why it's important to understand the distinction between the code and the guide and how they're both used. So there are some useful tools and templates. There are some design verification statement templates, which give you a development standards checklist and the ability, as I said before, to complete the design verification statement. And then there's the design criteria consistency template, where you can literally, for the different type of development you're trying to achieve, you can identify the different criteria and how you are consistent with that criteria. And lastly, there are some tools and templates that you can use with the tools and templates, there's a glossary of terms in there as well to assist with the compiling of the information that you need in order to do your CDC and your design verification statement. Just a couple of things. I also like to add some value with my presentations. What we do at Smart Planning Design is we pull together teams to help you do exactly this sort of work, to pull together these types of applications and process these applications. Some tricks of the trade that I love to talk about over the years I've learnt to make the process smoother. Do your due diligence at your application stage, including checking your title and covenant. Get to know your planners that you're working with. Engage good quality plans. Engage really good consultants and keep an eye on your deadlines. These are just some of the things we've learned over the years. Some keys to design success, apart from making sure that you're complying with all the elements within the guides. and the planning schemes and the like. Has some really good landscape edges, retain your trees. We've had a lot of issues with trees recently, both in New South Wales and Victoria, with our applications. Minimise your off-site and on-site amenity impacts. Make sure you reflect good with the built form character as much as you can, and have great transition or transition your form and materials by understanding the character of the area. If you are going to do, if you're trying to achieve higher development forms or development forms that may be different to the norm in the area. And I think that's about it. I will, there's some of my projects, but I won't go on about those. Remember that we're all part of a fantastic design and development community. We love development. We break it down to feasibility, approvals, and building. We love helping people with their development journey. We think development is fab, and I want to thank you for that ability to have the presentation. I'll give you the presentation tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. That was extremely detailed. I'm going to open, we've got a few questions here. Give yourself a little bit of a breather while I get, if anyone would like to ask or comment, please feel free to do so on Facebook land and the Zoom chat. What I'd like to do, David, I would like to, and I haven't said this to you yet, Richard. I don't know if you're available. I'd like to invite Richard, who is a developer who has had some experience with this code as well, to be able to, I guess, comment a little bit as well on his experience and what the difference is with the previous code and this code, and his thoughts around whether it's going to make it sort of easier for developers. Richard, are you there?
I'm here, Cheryl.
Thank you. Is it okay that we drag you into the conversation?
Sure, I'll help where I can.
Excellent. So we just had a few quick questions in the group chat. Parvin's asked, what class are these builds? And Richard, you've mentioned that the manors are class 2. Terraces and side-by-side dual ox are class 1A with a firewall in between, and dual ox one above the other are class 2. Just with that, and you mentioned the dual ox one above the other, how different are they to manor houses?
It's exactly the same rules for manor houses as dual ox one above the other.
Okay. Yep. Just a different wording, and I guess manors can be 2 to 4 properties. On a practical sense, like there's and David, you did a very good job to be able to go through all the different criteria, which I have to admit gave me a little bit of a headache because there's a lot in there.
There is a lot in there. There's a hell of a lot in there.
Richard, from a practical sense, in your experience, like how easy, and I don't want to use the word easy, but is it going to be as easy or as fast-tracked a process as we hope for it to be?
It will be faster, but not initially. As the consultants come up to speed, like for the most parts, certifiers, for example, get paid for doing the work that their clients engage them for. And there's been no work under this code in most council areas yet. So there's been no incentive for them to learn it, to become experts at it, to help you as a small developer that might be interested in using it for the first time. So, but there are people out there using it now. There's probably the most opportunities are with the duplexes, the dual occupancies. However, they're not necessarily in most areas a feasible product to build. The opportunities are not probably as common there as a percentage of properties that you could do a dual lock on under this. And in lots of instances, a DA dual lock will actually give you a better product. But these will give you a quicker product. you still need to go to council to get a number of your approvals. You've still got to get section 138 approved, your construction certificate, section 68 approval. You've got to comply with a DCP for stormwater discharge. So there's still a number of interactions you need to have with council, though technically it's not a DA.
Mm.
So there's a number of opportunities out there, Cheryl, but it's still not straightforward, and it's not going to be quite as quick as people think, especially not initially as consultants get up to speed. Also with designs, there's good and bad designs. I think that some designs will squeeze onto blocks really well and potentially get an extra dwelling or extra bedrooms that other designers won't do. But landscaping is definitely one of the landscaping and parking are probably two of the biggest concerns and hardest things to make work on the designs. Hence why if you can get a rear lane or maybe a corner block, they can work really well.
So I know that with the code that was superseded, a lot of councils were on a little bit of a standstill as to whether they were going to adopt them. Is it the case that everyone is on board for this new code?
Every council in New South Wales now, this code applies to. They have been forced by the state government to adopt it. A number of those councils are still in the process of amending their LEPs or have amended their LEPs to potentially affect the code in different ways. For example, a number of councils have actually increased the lot size required to do a dual OC because of this code. So now in many councils, there's actually less properties that you can do a dual OC on compared to what there were previously.
The way the code is written, Cheryl, is that it implies that councils are on board, and it implies that, and my understanding, different to the previous work that applied, that the state is very serious. The way it's written, the state is very serious about councils applying the code and the guide and getting it used by councils.
Yeah, and I think that's where, I mean, I think it was released a good year ago, and everyone was quite excited by what it was going to do, and it didn't quite deliver the results that people were looking for. So where do you see, and this is a question from Richard on the Facebook land, where do you see the opportunities that this code provides, noting the comments that Richard did make about, you know, dual occupancies? For a lot of them, they don't quite stack up, not in New South Wales. If they do, it's that needle in the haystack. Is it more towards the terraces?
Well, Richard, do you want to answer that? Because I've got my own views about it, but maybe you first as the man on the ground.
No, it's my question, but I suppose I was just looking for your thoughts on the matter. Where I see opportunities is where the SEP specifies lower minimum lot widths than the LEP may. You're still constrained by the LEP dimensions for dual locks. For the other designs, unfortunately, on the 1st of July reissue, a lot of power was given back to councils on the LEPs for minimum lot sizes for manor houses and terraces. So I see some of the opportunities there have potentially been closed. But there's definitely opportunities out there where council LEPs are not as prescriptive.
Yes. In my experience, because I've seen a number of these different codes or similar things in the past try to be introduced, and the answer isn't as simple as one form or the other, simply because different areas and different existing lot sizes have different design responses and opportunities. And so, you know, in certain council areas and in certain markets, development markets, because there's not no such thing as one development market. In certain development markets, the application of the code will be easier and more profitable in terms of yield, and will result in different opportunities in terms of typology, depending on where you are, and depending on the existing conditions that exist. And I've certainly seen that in the past, over the last 30 years or so, when new planning rules are applied, there are always sometimes unintended consequences. You may end up with different types of, and this is yet to play itself out, I think, because it's early days. And so we'll to a certain extent, we'll have to wait and see as to what it results in, and where different applications of the code and the guide are best suited across New South Wales.
Yeah, and so it seems like it is still sort of, as you say, it's really very much early days. We've got to find the right people, particularly the architects, who are familiar, or who have made themselves familiar with the code.
Yes, right.
And know sort of, I guess, for want of a better word, the tricks of the trade to be able to get it through that fast track process.
And just one other thing I'd say, Cheryl, is that one of the tricks of the trade that you should always apply, I believe, is at the start of a development project, is to seriously think about which way you want to go in terms of what we call the planning pathway, because strategy is really important very early on. So understanding which pathway, which approvals pathway you want to go down, and balancing that against your ultimate objectives and outcomes, yield, profit, etc., in your development, and thinking about timeframes for the fast track, so-called supposedly fast track versus standard timeframes, is all really important early on. And as I said before, one of the tricks of the trade, I always think, is to surround yourselves with the right team. So absolutely make sure that you're getting excellent advice in terms of the planning pathway. Decide, and that will help you decide which approvals process you'll go down. But make sure you get consultants that understand this code and these guides if you're going to use this planning pathway.
Yeah, that's such an important point. The team, like we always talk about, anyone that's looking to start in any sort of development, make sure you've got your team and your structure in place. I've got another question here from Deborah. She says, I've heard that you have to inform the neighbours under this process, which would seem to defeat the purpose if they can complain for any reason and delay the process, even if everything else complies. Is this correct?
I'll be honest, I don't know. And I think from what I understand, it depends on the council. Different councils have different rules in terms of notification. Some councils I work with, even though it may statutorily not require notification and or putting it out on public exhibition. Some councils also just prefer to do that as well. That was actually one of the questions I rang the department a couple of days ago to try and find out the answer to, and I haven't yet got the answer. So it's a really good question, because objection rights as such are really important part of your what I call our planning your planning pathway. Understanding the risk profile as it relates to objectives is an incredibly important thing to understand before you go down that path, that development path. Yeah, fantastic question, I'll let you know when I get the answer. I'm expecting a call back tomorrow, Cheryl.
Yeah, and I totally agree there. I mean, the whole idea of going through a CDC process is to fast track it and to be able to say I've ticked all the boxes. Why would there be a complaint in any case? Richard says he has part of the answer.
Just to interrupt there, the neighbours are definitely informed, but they do not have objection rights. The certifier informs them, if I remember correctly, 14 days prior to issue of the CDC and after issue of the CDC, if I remember rightly. So yes, the neighbours are definitely informed that an approval has been granted, but they are notified that an approval will be granted and then it has been granted, not that they have any rights to complain about it or otherwise.
Yeah, so it's a notification process as opposed to a public exhibition type.
Yes.
But having said that, I'll just reiterate that we often, as planning practitioners, have councils that try and pull the wool over people's eyes in relation to notifications and the like, and so you do have to be on your game and know the rules and be willing to push back if necessary.
Excellent. Excellent. So let me see if there's any other questions. Oh, I've got more requests from Lauren. She's asked if the slideshows can be emailed out.
Absolutely. Yes.
If you would like, shall I put your email in the Zoom chat, and if anyone wanted the slides, they can email you.
And also I'll give you a copy, Cheryl, after this.
Okay. Yeah, fantastic.
Send it to everybody.
That's excellent. So it looks like it might be something we might have to touch base on in the next sort of 12 months or so to see how it's all sort of unraveled. I mean, noting that it's the code as it is now, was started on the 1st of July, so it's still very, very, very fresh. But it's good to know that we've moved ahead in terms of all the councils being on board, whether they like it or not. It seems to be the case. But it will be interesting to see and speak to a few developers that will be using this successfully as well. Yes. So thank you for all that time and your generosity as well, David. Just to reiterate, David does operate mainly Victoria and New South Wales, and in other states as well, David?
I do applications around Australia when I feel, but primarily in New South Wales and Victoria. My business is, we do strategic planning, we do planning scheme amendments, we do rezonings, but 90% of our business is getting people development approvals, and that's in New South Wales and Victoria.
Fantastic. We like that. Oh, last question. There's always last one. Just curious if the dual occupancy dwellings are strata titled. Are you able to on-sell separately? Oh, good question. Or are they Torrens title?
So you can get you can do a subdivision as part of this process.
Yeah, and that comes down to the zoning as well, because if you can do so under that particular zoning, which is R1, R2, R3, and RU5, I believe.
Yes, correct.
If you can do so under the zonings, then that should be permissible as well.
That's right. So it allows for concurrent development and subdivision.
Excellent.
These manor houses and dwelling houses and multi-dwelling houses, sorry.
Fantastic. All right, I've added your email to the Zoom chat, and I'll pop it onto the Facebook group as well. Thank you kindly, David. Very, very informative. It's got me thinking as well in terms of what we're doing.
Yeah.
And if anyone has any other experience they would love to share, please get in touch with me, David. Just comment on the Facebook chat as well.
All right.
Have a great evening. Thanks, everyone. Take care and be safe. Bye-bye. Good night.